Somewhere in a filing cabinet in the English countryside, in a folder that stayed sealed for 30 years, there is a signature. It belongs to a woman who was 18 when she wrote it, a woman who had never been more than a few miles from home before the war. Underneath her name is a sentence she was made to read aloud before anyone would tell her what her job actually was. It said that if she ever spoke of her work, to a friend, to a parent, to the man she would one day marry, she could be prosecuted for treason. In the United States, more than 10,000 women signed a version of that same promise. One of them, a young Army recruit at a converted girls' school in Virginia, was told plainly in her very first lecture that anyone caught repeating what she heard inside that building would be treated as a spy, and that in wartime, spies were shot. She remembered that sentence for the rest of her life. Some of these women kept their silence so completely that their own children did not learn the truth until they read it in a newspaper decades later, long after their mothers had died. Officially, these women did secretarial work. They filed papers, they answered telephones. Officially, there is very little to say about them at all. Unofficially, they were breaking the codes that shortened a war by years, and running machines that helped build a weapon that would end it, working through the coldest, quietest hours of the night in rooms that do not appear on any map from those years. Tonight, we go looking for those rooms. This is a story about night shifts. Not the ordinary kind, the ones worked by nurses or bakers or the men who kept the factories running while the day shift slept. This is about a very specific, very quiet category of wartime labor, the night shifts worked by women who were never supposed to be remembered for them at all. Between 1939 and 1945, tens of thousands of women across Britain and the United States were pulled into secret installations that did not exist on any public record. Some were sent to a country estate north of London to break the codes the German military believed were unbreakable. Some were sent to a town in the Tennessee hills that had no name on any map to sit in front of machines they were forbidden to ask questions about. Some were sent to a converted junior college for young ladies in Arlington, Virginia, and told before they even sat down at a desk that whatever they were about to learn had to disappear the moment they left the building. We tend to remember the men of this era, the generals, the codebreakers whose names made it into films, the physicists whose photographs hang in museum halls. What gets left out, again and again, is that the daily, grinding, essential work of listening, calculating, monitoring, and translating was done overwhelmingly by women, most of them barely out of their teens, working shifts that rotated through the middle of the night because the war did not pause for daylight. And when the war ended, most of them went home, took off their identification badges, and never spoke of it again. Not because they forgot, because they had promised not to remember out loud. That is the story tonight. Not a single woman, not a single place, but a pattern that repeats itself across an ocean, across 3 different secret institutions in 3 different countries, all keeping the same kind of silence for the same kind of reason. It is a story with real names in it where the names have survived, and real gaps where they have not, because that too is part of what happened to them. If you'd rather close your eyes for this one and just listen, this story and the rest of our library are also available as audiobooks on Spotify, and the link for that is sitting in the description below. If you enjoy listening to sleepy stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. It usually began with a letter, a plain envelope, government stationery, no explanation of what it was for. A young woman would open it at her kitchen table in a terraced house or a farm cottage or a cramped city flat and find only an instruction to report to an address she had never heard of on a date that did not give her much time to prepare. There was rarely a return address worth writing to. There was rarely anyone at home who could tell her what to expect. She packed a small case, said goodbye to a mother who had no idea where she was really going, and got on a train. In Britain, some of these letters arrived because of a crossword puzzle. The Daily Telegraph ran a competition in January of 1942, inviting readers to solve its crossword in under 12 minutes. It seemed on the surface like an ordinary diversion for a wartime newspaper trying to keep its readers' minds occupied. It was not entirely ordinary. Government recruiters were quietly watching the results, looking for a very particular kind of mind. Quick, pattern-hungry, comfortable sitting with an unsolved problem until it gave way. Several of the fastest solvers received a visit shortly afterward, an invitation to an interview that explained almost nothing about what the job actually was. For others, the recruitment was less playful and considerably more mundane on its surface. A young woman would be asked, in an ordinary government interview room, whether she knew any German. If she said she had studied 2 years of it in secondary school, that was sometimes enough. She would be told nothing else, only that her linguistic memory, however rusty, had just been noted down somewhere important. One woman recalled being herded into a chapel with a group of other recruits and hearing an official simply ask the room at large, "Does anyone know German?" as though the answer might determine the whole shape of the next 3 years of her life. For her, it did. In the United States, the search widened even further. As American men shipped overseas in growing numbers, the intelligence agencies that had once drawn almost exclusively from Ivy League mathematics departments began looking somewhere else entirely. Schoolrooms. Small-town schoolteachers, many of them from the American South, found themselves quietly approached by recruiters who had noticed something in their record. Teaching, it turned out, demanded exactly the kind of patient, detail-oriented, endlessly repetitive attention that code-breaking required. A woman who had spent years diagramming sentences on a blackboard for restless 12-year-olds turned out to be remarkably well-suited to staring at columns of intercepted enemy text until a pattern finally surfaced. At a former women's junior college in Arlington, Virginia, seized by the Army under wartime emergency powers in the summer of 1942, these teachers began arriving by the hundreds. The campus had been built for the quiet, orderly business of educating young ladies in etiquette and literature. Within months, it had become one of the most secure intelligence installations in the country, its ivy-covered brick buildings repurposed for a kind of work its original architects could never have imagined. By the end of the war, roughly 7,000 of the 10,500 people working there were women. Further south, in a Tennessee valley that had until very recently been quiet farmland and modest homesteads, an entirely different kind of recruitment was underway. Recruiters descended on rural high schools, offering graduating senior girls a job that came with almost no description attached. It paid well by local standards, it came with company housing, and it asked only for a diploma and a willingness to follow instructions without asking too many questions. Thousands of young women signed on, many of them leaving home for the very first time, boarding buses that carried them toward a town that, officially, did not exist. That town would eventually be called Oak Ridge, though for most of the war it appeared on no public map at all. It had been carved out of the hills almost overnight, a sprawling secret city built to house tens of thousands of workers whose job it was to help refine the fuel for a weapon nobody outside a very small circle was permitted to know about. By 1945, more than 75,000 people lived and worked inside its fences. Most of them, including most of the young women arriving weekly by the busload, had no idea what any of it was for. There is something quietly remarkable about how ordinary the recruitment felt to the women living through it. It rarely announced itself as history in the making. It looked from the inside like any other wartime job posting. Modest pay, a uniform or a badge, a supervisor who seemed a little too serious about the rules. Few of them walked through those gates imagining they were about to become part of one of the most consequential intelligence and engineering operations of the 20th century. Most of them were simply looking for steady work while the men they knew were away fighting. You may find yourself wondering what it must have felt like, stepping off a train or a bus into a place with no name, holding a small suitcase and a letter that explained almost nothing, trusting that a government you had never had much reason to think about before the war knew what it was doing with you. There is no single answer. Some of the women who lived it later described a kind of nervous excitement, the sense of finally being needed for something larger than themselves. Others described a plain, practical resignation. It was wartime. Everyone was being asked to do something they had not chosen and could not fully understand. This, at least, came with a paycheck. What almost none of them expected was the moment that came next, the moment before the first day of work even properly began, when they would be handed a document, told to read it carefully, and asked to sign their name to a promise that would follow them, silently, for the rest of their lives. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a room when someone is about to tell you something serious. The women who passed through the gates of Bletchley Park or Arlington Hall or the checkpoints at Oak Ridge all describe some version of that quiet, the moment just before the paperwork was placed in front of them. In Britain, it was the official Secrets Act. A young woman named Becky Webb, 18 years old when she joined the war effort in 1941, remembered being told to sign it before she had even been shown where she would be working. She later called the experience frightening for someone as young and inexperienced as she was. She had no real idea, she admitted, how she was even supposed to comply with a promise that vague. What exactly was she not allowed to say? She would not find out until she was already inside. The document itself did not explain the work. It simply made clear that discussing it in any form with any person at any point in the future was a criminal offense, not an embarrassment, not a breach of workplace etiquette, a crime with real legal consequences attached. For a teenager who had grown up believing that honesty with her own parents was simply what a good daughter did, the idea of carrying a permanent, legally enforced secret from her own mother and father was disorienting in a way that took time to settle. In the United States, the language used with recruits was, if anything, blunter. One Army recruit remembered her very first lecture at Arlington Hall consisting of exactly 2 words, repeated with total seriousness: "Don't talk." She was told that anyone caught discussing the work outside the building would be treated exactly as a spy would be treated in wartime, and that spies, in wartime, were shot. The Navy delivered the same warning to its own recruits in almost identical language. There was no room in either version for misunderstanding. This was not a gentle workplace policy. It was framed deliberately as a matter of life and death. Imagine for a moment sitting at 18 or 19 years old hearing that sentence for the first time and understanding that you had already agreed to keep this secret before you knew what it was. There was no negotiating room. No one handed you the document, let you read the fine print, and offered you the option of quietly declining and going home instead. By the time you understood the size of what you were promising, you were already inside the fence. At Oak Ridge, the language leaned less on legal threat and more on appeals to conscience and duty, though the underlying message was the same. New arrivals were gathered before their first shift and told, in essence, that they were about to be trained to do something important, and that they would never be told what it actually was. One supervisor, addressing a room of young women who had barely finished high school, put it with a bluntness that has survived in several of their later accounts. "We can train you how to do what is needed," he told them. "But we cannot tell you what you are doing. All I can tell you is that if our enemies beat us to it, God have mercy on us all." Another recruit remembered a slightly different version of the same warning, phrased more like a house rule than a national security briefing. "What you learn here and what you do here," she was told, "stays here. Don't tell your family, don't tell your friends. All you need to know is that you are helping to end the war." It was, in its own way, a remarkably effective piece of instruction. It gave these women almost nothing to hold on to except the vague, enormous idea that their labor mattered, and the very specific, very concrete understanding that talking about it could cost them everything. There is something worth sitting with here, something the postcard version of this era rarely makes room for. These were not intelligence officers with years of training in operational secrecy. Many of them were teenagers who, 6 months earlier, had been worrying about school dances and family suppers, and here they were, being asked to carry a legal and moral weight that most adults never have to shoulder even once in their lives, without ever fully understanding what it was they were protecting. Some of them adapted to the secrecy the way people adapt to any new and unfamiliar discipline, slowly, imperfectly, learning the shape of the silence by trial and error. They learned which questions were safe to ask a coworker and which were not. They learned to change the subject smoothly when a curious cousin asked what exactly her new job involved. They learned to answer, when pressed, with the same flat, rehearsed sentence that Bletchley codebreaker Eleanor Ireland later remembered giving to anyone who asked. If anyone asked what we did, she said, we were to say that we did secretarial work. It was not entirely a lie. There was secretarial work happening in these buildings, real filing, real correspondence, real administrative labor that kept the larger operation running. But for a significant number of these women, it was a convenient half-truth stretched over something enormous. Somewhere behind the mundane cover story sat a Colossus machine helping to decrypt German high command communications, or a bank of calutrons refining the fuel for a weapon that would end the war in the Pacific, or a desk covered in intercepted Japanese naval traffic that, properly read, could reveal the location of an entire fleet. They carried that gap between what they said and what they did for years, for some of them for the rest of their lives. Picture the approach to Bletchley Park on a winter night, the kind of night when the fog sits low over the flat English countryside and the blackout swallows every trace of light for miles. A young woman walks the last stretch from the railway station on foot, her shoes crunching against gravel she cannot quite see, guided mostly by memory and the vague pale shape of the road ahead. Somewhere in the dark, a dog barks once and falls silent. She has made this walk perhaps 100 times by now, and still, every night, there is a small flicker of unease at the barbed wire fence that appears out of the fog before the house itself does. The estate itself, when she finally reaches it, looks almost absurdly ordinary for what it contains. A grand Victorian manor house with a lake and manicured grounds, the kind of property that once hosted country weekends and garden parties. During the war, that stately house became the administrative heart of Britain's government code and cipher school, while the real grinding work spilled outward into a scattering of hastily built wooden huts and squat concrete blocks that had sprung up across the lawn like an uninvited settlement. Armed guards stand at the gate, checking identification against names on a list, even for the women who have walked this same path every night for a year. There is no casual entry here, no wave-through for a familiar face. The high fences, topped with barbed wire, ring the whole property, a reminder, if anyone needed it, that whatever happens inside these huts is being protected as fiercely as anything in the country. Inside, the atmosphere shifts entirely from the grand house to the huts themselves, which are cramped, draughty, and lit by bare bulbs that hum faintly against the quiet of a night shift. The work here runs around the clock, divided into rotating 8-hour blocks so that the huts never truly sleep even when the rest of the country has gone dark. By the end of 1944, women made up more than 3/4 of the roughly 7,000 people employed here, working as cryptanalysts, linguists, traffic analysts, clerks, machine operators, drivers, and cooks. Aside from senior management and the armed guards at the perimeter, almost every role on the estate was, in some capacity, held by a woman. Some of them worked directly on the codes themselves. Margaret Rock spent her nights wrestling with German and Russian ciphers, work so precise and demanding that Dilly Knox, a veteran cryptanalyst who had helped crack codes in the previous war, once described her as among the 4 or 5 best minds on the entire Enigma staff. Mavis Beatty, still a very young woman during her years there, decoded a message that revealed the exact date of a planned Italian naval attack, intelligence that shaped one of the more decisive Allied naval victories of the war. These were not clerical footnotes to the men's work. They were, by any honest measure, some of the sharpest minds in the building. Most of the women, though, were not working at that rarefied analytical level. They operated the machinery that made the analysis possible in the first place, tending banks of Bombay machines that whirred and clicked through the night, testing combination after combination against intercepted German traffic, hunting for the daily settings that would unlock an entire day's worth of enemy communication. It was repetitive, exacting labor, hour after hour of careful attention with almost no room for error, and it had to happen continuously because the settings changed every midnight, and every hour lost to a mistake was an hour the enemy kept its secrets a little longer. Later in the war, an even more advanced machine arrived, one built to tackle a far more complex German cipher used for the highest levels of military communication. It was called Colossus, and it is now recognized as one of the earliest electronic digital computers ever built, a genuine landmark in the history of computing. 273 women were recruited specifically to operate these machines, trained in painstaking detail on procedures they were told never to describe to anyone outside the hut. The secrecy surrounding Colossus ran so deep that many of the women who spent their nights operating it did not even learn its name until decades later. One of them, Eleanor Ireland, would later say that when anyone asked what she did during the war, she simply told them she had done secretarial work, because that was the cover story she had been given and had lived inside for 30 years. You may find yourself wondering what it felt like to operate a machine you were not permitted to name night after night without ever fully understanding its place in the larger war. There is a particular kind of discipline required for that, a willingness to do careful, meaningful work while accepting that the meaning itself would remain just out of reach. Life outside the huts had its own particular rhythm, shaped entirely around the demands of shift work. At one of Bletchley's outlying stations, as many as 72 women might share a single dormitory at any given time. bunks arranged in tight rows, some sleeping through the brightest hours of the afternoon, while others readied themselves for the walk back to the huts as evening settled in. The ordinary rhythms of a young woman's life, meals, sleep, letters home, had to be entirely rebuilt around a schedule that ran opposite to everyone she had grown up with. Recruitment for the estate reached deep into England's universities as well. Newnham College, a women's college at Cambridge, sent at least 77 of its students to Bletchley during the war, even as the university itself still refused to grant its women full degrees. One of them, a mathematician named Joan Clark, arrived in 1940 with a double first in mathematics and went on to work in Hut 8, the section devoted to attacking German naval codes that, once broken, helped protect the Atlantic convoys carrying food and fuel to a beleaguered island nation. Another Cambridge-educated codebreaker, a woman later identified as Jane Monroe, developed a habit that seems, in retrospect, almost a small act of quiet rebellion. When people asked what she did at Bletchley, she would answer airily, without hesitation, that she made the tea. It was a joke only she and a handful of colleagues could ever fully appreciate, a private thread of humour running beneath a life otherwise defined by things she was forbidden to say out loud. The secrecy surrounding this entire estate did not lift when the war ended. It held for 30 years, unbroken, an entire generation of women carrying the same silence through the rest of their adult lives, through marriages and children and grandchildren, before the British government finally began declassifying the details in the mid-1970s. For 3 decades, the country these women had helped save had no idea what they had done to save it. 4,000 miles away, in the folded hills of eastern Tennessee, an entirely different kind of secret was taking shape, and it was being kept in large part by an entirely different set of young women. Where Bletchley Park hid behind a fence around an old manor house, Oak Ridge hid behind something far larger. It hid an entire city. Before the war, this stretch of valley had been quiet farmland, small homesteads, family cemeteries, the kind of place where the biggest event of a given month might be a church social. In 1942, the federal government arrived, acquired the land under wartime authority, and began building at a pace that must have seemed almost frightening to anyone watching from a distance. Within 3 years, a settlement that had not existed before the war housed more than 75,000 people, and it did not appear on a single publicly available map. Locals took to calling it simply the Secret City. The young women who arrived here came almost entirely by a different route than the women of Bletchley. There was no crossword puzzle competition, no elite university recruitment. Recruiters visited rural high schools across the region and offered fresh graduates a job that came with almost no job description attached, only a promise of steady pay, clean company housing, and work that mattered to the war effort. For many of these young women, most of them barely out of their teens, it was their very first time away from home, their very first paycheck, their very first taste of independence, wrapped inside one of the most consequential and dangerous scientific projects in human history. They were trained to sit at long control panels, watching needles and dials on machines called calutrons, adjusting knobs whenever a reading drifted off center. The instructions were kept deliberately, almost comically simple. Keep the needle centered. If it drifts to the right, turn this knob left. If it drifts left, turn the opposite knob right. If the machine sparks or behaves strangely, call a supervisor immediately and do not attempt to diagnose the problem yourself. Nobody explained what the needle was actually measuring, or what the machine was actually doing, or why it mattered so intensely that it be kept centered at every hour of the day and night. What they were doing, though none of them were told at the time, was helping to separate a rare and precious isotope of uranium from the far more common form found in nature, refining, dial by careful dial, the fuel that would eventually be used in the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. They were, without knowing it, monitoring one of the most consequential machines built in the 20th century night after night for a wage that was, by the standards of rural Tennessee in 1943, remarkably good. Some of them noticed strange things about the work, even without understanding what caused them. The magnetic fields generated inside the control rooms were powerful enough to tug bobby pins straight out of a woman's carefully pinned hair, or pull a screwdriver clean out of a supervisor's pocket if he wandered too close to certain sections of the panel. It was the kind of detail that made a young woman wonder quietly exactly what she had signed up for, even as she understood that asking directly was not something anyone did here. Curiosity, in fact, carried a very specific cost. Several of the women later recalled co-workers who simply vanished from their positions without warning or explanation, disappearing from the shift roster overnight, never seen at the dormitory again. The unspoken understanding that spread through the workforce was that these were the women who had asked too many questions, who had pressed a supervisor a little too hard about what, exactly, the Calitron was for. Whether or not every disappearance had that exact cause, the story did its job. It kept people quiet. And it worked in ways that surprised even the scientists who designed the machines. In an informal contest run at the facility, comparing the Calitron operators against a group of trained physicists performing the identical monitoring task, the young women from rural Tennessee outperformed the PhDs. The scientists, it turned out, could not resist trying to diagnose and correct problems themselves the moment a reading looked strange, second-guessing the machine, adjusting variables they only half understood. The women, trained simply to notice a deviation and report it immediately, kept the process running with a steadiness the more educated operators could not match. Their ignorance of the underlying physics in this one narrow and very specific way had become an asset. Security at Oak Ridge extended well beyond a simple promise of silence. New arrivals were subjected to lie detector screenings as part of their security clearance, an unusually invasive step for a workforce made up largely of teenagers straight out of high school. Billboards scattered across the site reminded workers, in blunt language, of the stakes involved in careless talk. And still, for the overwhelming majority of the roughly 10,000 women who spent the war watching those dials, the actual purpose of their labor remained a mystery until the morning newspapers announced, in August of 1945, that an atomic bomb had been dropped on a Japanese city, and that the uranium inside it had come from a plant in Tennessee that many of them had walked past every single day. One woman who lived through it later described the strange, dislocating feeling of that morning. She had spent 2 years of her young life turning knobs to keep a needle centered, trusting that it mattered, without ever imagining what, precisely, it had been building toward. She said, decades afterward, that she still thought about it. The sentence has stayed with people who have read her account ever since, not because it is dramatic, but because of how quietly it captures the strange position these women occupied at the exact center of one of history's most consequential projects, and simultaneously entirely outside of understanding what they were part of. There is a version of this story that treats it as a curiosity, an odd historical footnote about girls who didn't know what they were building. It is worth resisting that framing. These were not passive bystanders. They were skilled, disciplined workers whose steady attention, night after night, made a scientific and industrial process function at a scale nothing in human history had attempted before. The not knowing was not a flaw in their contribution. It was a condition imposed on them deliberately by a government that had decided their competence mattered far more than their understanding. Before the war, Arlington Hall was a junior college for young women, a quiet campus of brick buildings in Northern Virginia, devoted to teaching etiquette, literature, and the general polish expected of a certain kind of young lady heading into society. It struggled financially through the 1930s, as many small private colleges did, and by the time the war reached American shores, it was a fading institution, looking quietly for a way to survive. In June of 1942, survival arrived in a form nobody at the school could have anticipated. The United States Army seized the campus under wartime emergency powers, and within a matter of months, this genteel finishing school had become the headquarters of the Army's Signal Intelligence Service, one of the most closely guarded intelligence operations in the country. The gardens where students had once strolled between literature lectures were now patrolled by armed guards. The classrooms where young women had studied French conversation were repurposed for the far more consequential work of intercepting and decrypting enemy communications from across the Pacific and the Atlantic. The women who filled those repurposed classrooms came from a wider range of backgrounds than the Bletchley recruits, though they arrived carrying the same weight of secrecy. Alongside the school teachers recruited from small towns across the South were graduates of elite women's colleges, mathematicians and linguists whose talents had, until the war, had almost nowhere respectable to go. One of them, Genevieve Grotjean, working carefully through patterns in intercepted Japanese diplomatic traffic, made a breakthrough discovery that helped crack the Japanese purple cipher, a moment now recognized as one of the pivotal achievements of American wartime cryptanalysis. Her name, for decades, meant nothing to anyone outside a very small circle. The work itself demanded a particular kind of endurance. Intercepted messages arrived in an unbroken stream, day and night, coded in ciphers that changed constantly, and the women assigned to work them often did so in punishing, repetitive stretches, sorting, comparing, cross-referencing thousands of intercepted fragments in search of the pattern that would finally crack a system open. Ankara Christie, who would go on to a long career in American intelligence after the war, one of the very few women to do so, later recalled that her earliest work involved simply sorting through reams of intercepted traffic, tedious in a way that tested patience far more than brilliance, at least at first. By the war's end, roughly 7,000 of the 10,500 people working at Arlington Hall were women. They had cracked Japanese military and diplomatic codes that shaped some of the most consequential decisions of the Pacific War, including intelligence that helped Allied forces track and ultimately shoot down the aircraft carrying Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor. This was not marginal, supportive labor happening quietly in the background of the real war. This was, by any honest accounting, some of the most operationally significant intelligence work of the entire conflict, and it was overwhelmingly done by women whose official job titles described them as clerks and typists. Not every recruit at Arlington Hall arrived through the schoolteacher pipeline or the elite college pipeline. A significant and rarely discussed portion of the workforce belonged to a segregated African-American unit assigned to analyze commercial codes, tracking which companies and individuals were conducting business with Axis powers. Their existence at Arlington Hall stood in sharp contrast to the Navy's own code-breaking operation nearby, which excluded black women from its ranks entirely, even after African-American women were finally admitted into the Navy's WAVES program in 1945. The Army's willingness to include this unit while still operating within a deeply segregated wartime military meant that a group of black women contributed directly to American intelligence gathering during the war, their names and their work almost entirely absent from the histories written in the decades that followed. Just north of Arlington Hall, at a Navy communications complex on Nebraska Avenue in Washington, another workforce of women, this one belonging to the Navy's WAVES program, focused its nights on a different set of ciphers entirely, working through German naval traffic and later the Japanese naval code known as JN-25. One young recruit, fresh out of what is now Carnegie Mellon University, remembered being funneled through a chapel on her first day, along with dozens of other new arrivals, and hearing an officer simply ask the group whether anyone spoke German. She had studied it briefly in high school. That single, half-remembered answer determined the next several years of her life, assigning her to a code-breaking unit she had, moments earlier, had no idea existed. It is worth pausing here to mention, quietly, that if this kind of story is the sort of thing that helps you drift off, the full library of them is also available as audiobooks on Spotify, and you'll find the link waiting in the pinned comment. The secrecy oath administered to new recruits at Arlington Hall carried its own strange, almost ceremonial weight. It was often given by a woman named Jo Palumbo, the daughter of an Italian immigrant laborer, whose seriousness in administering the promise left such an impression on one new codebreaker that the woman later wrote a poem in her honor, a small private tribute to the gravity of the moment none of them were ever permitted to describe. What strikes anyone reading these women's later accounts decades on is how completely the promise of secrecy became a part of their daily identity. Not a rule imposed from outside, but something they carried inside themselves, quietly, for the rest of their lives. One of them, describing the years of silence that followed the war, put it as simply as it can be put. "We were doing something absolutely essential to winning the war," she said, "but we couldn't tell anyone about it." That sentence, spoken by a woman whose name history did not think to record, could belong to almost any of them, in almost any of these three secret places. By 1945, across Bletchley Park, Oak Ridge, and Arlington Hall alone, close to 25,000 women were living some version of this exact life, working through the night on tasks of enormous consequence, sworn to a silence they had agreed to before they understood what it would cost them, quietly reshaping the outcome of the largest war in human history from rooms that, officially, held nothing more important than filing cabinets and typewriters. Leave time came rarely, and when it did, it brought its own particular strain. A young woman who had spent months learning to read intercepted enemy traffic or monitoring a machine she wasn't permitted to name would step off a train back into the ordinary rhythms of her family's kitchen and find herself facing a question she had rehearsed dozens of times but never grown comfortable answering. So, what exactly do you do all day? The rehearsed answer came easily enough by then. Filing, typing, secretarial work mostly, nothing very interesting. Her mother might press a little further, curious in the ordinary, loving way mothers are curious about their daughters' lives, and she would have to gently close the door on that curiosity again and again, watching her mother's small flicker of disappointment at being kept at arm's length from something that clearly mattered to her child. It was, for many of these women, one of the quieter costs of the work, a cost that never appeared on any casualty list and was never acknowledged in any official history. The secrecy did not simply protect a set of facts, it reshaped the ordinary intimacy of family life, inserting a door that could not be opened even for the people who loved them most. A woman might sit at her mother's table eating a meal she had missed for months and still be in some essential way alone with what she knew. For some, the silence extended even into marriage. Margaret Wilson, who had spent her nights at Bletchley Park recording German radio transmissions, did not tell her own husband about her wartime work until very late in her life, well into her 90s. Her greatest regret, she said afterward, was that she had never told him while he was still alive to hear it. They had built an entire marriage, decades of shared meals and shared rooms and shared grief and shared joy, with this one enormous fact sitting quietly, permanently, just outside the boundary of what she felt able to say. It is worth pausing on the strangeness of that. Marriage, in the ordinary understanding of it, is often described as a kind of total honesty, two people building a shared life with nothing significant held back. And yet here were women who had internalized their wartime promise so completely that it survived even that intimacy, outlasting courtships and weddings and the raising of children, a locked room inside an otherwise open life. Some women found small private outlets for the pressure. The Bletchley codebreaker, who used to tell curious acquaintances that she simply made the tea, was, in her own quiet way, managing the weight of what she couldn't say by turning it into something almost like a joke, a phrase she could deploy without lying outright and without revealing anything true either. It was a kind of survival, learning to live inside a sentence that satisfied other people's curiosity just enough to end the conversation. Others carried the silence more heavily. Several of the American codebreakers interviewed decades later by researchers described a lingering hesitation even when speaking to historians who already knew, in broad outline, what had happened at Arlington Hall. One woman in her 90s, finally being asked directly about her wartime work after 70 years of silence, was still visibly unsure whether she was actually permitted to answer, even though the relevant information had long since been declassified. The habit of not saying had outlived by decades the legal requirement that had created it in the first place. There is a pattern worth noticing here, one that runs beneath all three of these institutions in slightly different forms. The women were asked to give up something that is easy to overlook, precisely because it isn't physical. Not their safety exactly, though the work sometimes carried real risk. Not their time, though the hours were brutal. What they gave up, quietly and for years, was the ordinary human right to be known, fully, by the people closest to them. A father never learned that his daughter had helped crack a naval code that saved Atlantic convoys. A husband never learned that his wife had spent her nights listening for the movements of enemy submarines. A child grew up and grew old without ever knowing that the quiet, unassuming woman who raised them had once held in her own hands a piece of the machinery that helped end a world war. And they carried it for the most part without complaint, without seeking recognition, without treating it as a burden worth mentioning. It simply became part of the architecture of their lives, a room they walked past every day and never opened, until, for many of them, it was finally too late to open it at all. When the war finally ended, first in Europe and then, months later, in the Pacific, the huts at Bletchley grew quieter, the shifts at Oak Ridge began winding down, and the desks at Arlington Hall slowly emptied of the women who had filled them for years. What followed, for most of them, was not a parade or a ceremony or any public acknowledgement of what they had done. It was, quite simply, dismissal, delivered with the same brisk efficiency that had once summoned them into secret work in the first place. The badges were collected. The dormitory rooms were vacated for the next occupant. Many of the women were given a small severance, a train ticket home, and a final reminder that the promise they had signed years earlier had not expired along with their employment. They were free to leave. They were not free to explain to anyone what they were leaving. Officially, they were veterans of a war effort that had reshaped the modern world. In practice, the professional world waiting for them at home had little interest in that fact, partly because they were not permitted to describe it, and partly because post-war America and Britain were both organizing themselves around a very different, very traditional idea of where women belonged. Returning male veterans were given priority for university admissions, for skilled positions, for the kind of professional advancement that recognized wartime service as a credential worth rewarding. Women who had spent years breaking codes or monitoring nuclear fuel enrichment mostly found themselves quietly redirected back towards secretarial pools, teaching positions, or simply toward marriage and motherhood, their extraordinary wartime competence treated as a temporary wartime aberration rather than a demonstrated skill worth building a career around. A small number found ways to continue the work. Anne Cara Christie, whose earliest task at Arlington Hall had been the tedious sorting of intercepted traffic, went on to a long and genuinely distinguished career in American intelligence, eventually rising to senior leadership within the National Security Agency. But researchers who have studied this generation of codebreakers are careful to note that she was very much the exception rather than the rule. Most of her colleagues, women whose analytical skill had been proven under enormous wartime pressure, simply left the field entirely, their training and their achievements folded quietly back into ordinary civilian life, unspoken and largely unrecognized. At Oak Ridge, the pattern repeated with its own particular texture. The secret city that had swelled to 75,000 residents during the war began to shrink almost immediately once its purpose became public knowledge in August of 1945. Many of the Calotron operators, the young women who had kept the atomic bomb's fuel refined through years of careful, disciplined attention, simply went home to the small towns they had come from, carrying a piece of world-altering history that most of their neighbors would never fully appreciate and that they themselves had barely understood while it was happening. There is a particular kind of quiet injustice in this pattern, one that deserves to be named plainly rather than softened. These women had been trusted with some of the most consequential, high-stakes labor of the entire war, work that demanded intelligence, discipline, and a rare capacity for sustained, careful attention under enormous pressure and secrecy. And the moment that labor was no longer needed, the society that had relied on it reverted almost instantly to treating these same women as though none of it had ever proven anything about what they were capable of. It would be easy to tell this part of the story with anger, and there is, honestly, room for some. But many of the women themselves, in the interviews and memoirs that survive, describe this period with something closer to weary acceptance than outrage. This was simply how the world worked in their experience, and they had never expected the war to permanently rearrange it. What comes through more often than resentment is something quieter and, in its own way, more affecting. A simple wish, expressed decades later to have been seen. Not celebrated necessarily, just seen accurately for what they had actually done. The Cold War, arriving almost immediately on the heels of victory, gave the secrecy surrounding all three institutions an entirely new reason to persist. The code-breaking techniques developed against Germany and Japan were now considered relevant to an emerging rivalry with the Soviet Union, and the governments on both sides of the Atlantic saw little reason to declassify methods that might still prove useful. What had begun as a wartime necessity simply continued, seamlessly, into a new and different conflict, extending the silence these women carried by decades they could not have anticipated when they first signed their names to a promise at 18 or 19 years old. There is a particular texture to the middle of a night shift, a stretch of hours that every one of these women, whether she worked in a Bletchley hut or an Oak Ridge control room or an Arlington Hall office, would have recognized instantly in one another had they ever been permitted to compare notes. It is worth slowing down here, letting the pace settle and simply sitting inside what those hours actually felt like. At Bletchley, the walk to the huts after dark had its own quiet ritual. Torches were forbidden, or at least strongly discouraged, so a woman learned to navigate by memory, by the pale gravel path underfoot, by the faint outline of the manor house against a sky that the blackout kept unusually, almost startlingly dark. The cold settled into wool coats and knitted gloves that never quite kept the English winter fully at bay. Inside the huts themselves, the air carried the particular smell of machine oil and hot vacuum tubes, mixed with cigarette smoke and the strong, slightly bitter tea that kept everyone moving through the smallest hours of the morning. The work itself, whatever form it took, settled into a rhythm somewhere between concentration and monotony. A bomb machine operator learned the particular clatter and whir of the drums as they cycled through possibilities, a sound so constant it eventually became a kind of white noise, present but unnoticed, the way a clock's ticking disappears from awareness after enough hours in the same room. Around 3 a.m, conversation in the hut tended to grow sparse, not from unfriendliness, but from the simple physical toll of working against the body's natural rhythm. Women who had grown up on ordinary farm or town schedules had to teach their bodies over weeks and months to feel alert at 2 a.m. and ready for sleep by mid-morning, a reversal that never fully stopped feeling strange, no matter how long they lived inside it. At Oak Ridge, the Calotron control rooms carried their own distinct atmosphere, warmer than the drafty English huts, filled with the low electrical hum of the machines themselves and the occasional sharp crackle when something needed a supervisor's attention. Young women sat on tall stools in long rows, eyes fixed on dials, hands resting near the adjustment knobs, the strange pull of the magnetic field occasionally tugging at a hairpin or a belt buckle in a way that had become, by now, simply part of the job rather than a source of alarm. Shift changes brought a brief flurry of conversation and movement, women arriving bundled against the Tennessee night, others heading out toward dormitories that, by daylight, would be full of the ordinary sounds of a town going about its business, oblivious to what had just ended its shift. The dormitories themselves, at all 3 sites, carried a particular kind of communal intimacy that many of these women would later describe with genuine warmth, one of the few unambiguously fond memories many of them carried from otherwise strange and demanding years. Bunks arranged close together, laughter passed quietly between beds after lights out, small kindnesses exchanged between women who had, in most cases, met each other only weeks or months earlier and would go on to share years of a secret life together. At one of Bletchley's outlying stations, as many as 72 women shared a single dormitory, an arrangement that by modern standards sounds almost impossibly close, and yet many of the women who lived through it later spoke of the friendships formed there as some of the deepest of their lives, forged in exhaustion and secrecy, and the particular closeness of women who could not fully explain their days to anyone else, but could, at least, sit quietly together in the same silence. At Arlington Hall, the atmosphere carried something of its former identity as a genteel women's college, even after its transformation into a fortress of American signals intelligence. The dining hall still served meals at long communal tables, and in the brief pauses between shifts, exhausted codebreakers might find a moment to sit together over weak wartime coffee, trading nothing of substance about their actual work, but sharing, instead, the small ordinary talk that kept them tethered to something like normal life. Letters from home were read and reread in these pauses. Photographs of brothers and fiancés serving overseas passed quietly from hand to hand, a reminder that even inside these strange, secret institutions, the ordinary emotional texture of wartime, the worry, the hope, the waiting, continued exactly as it did everywhere else. There is something worth noticing in how these 3 very different institutions, separated by an ocean and by entirely different kinds of secret work, produced such remarkably similar textures of daily life. The long stretches of repetitive, exacting attention, the particular quality of exhaustion that comes from working against your body's natural clock, night after night, for months or years at a time. The close improvised communities that formed in dormitories and canteens, women leaning on each other for the ordinary comforts they could not find anywhere else because almost no one else in their lives even knew where they were. By the time dawn approached, whether over the flat fields of Buckinghamshire or the ridged hills of Tennessee or the quiet Virginia countryside, the shift would begin winding down, machines powered off or handed over to the incoming day crew, dials logged, notes passed along, the particular fatigue of a completed night settling into shoulders and eyes. Walking back toward the dormitory as the sky lightened, a woman might catch sight of ordinary morning activity beginning around her. A milk delivery, a farmer moving cattle. The world waking up exactly as it always had, entirely unaware of what had just happened, quietly, through the night, in the buildings she was leaving behind. There was a peculiar kind of solitude in that morning walk, watching an ordinary day begin while carrying the private, unspeakable weight of everything that had just occurred in the dark. And yet, for most of these women, that solitude was never quite total. Somewhere behind her, in the dormitory she was walking toward, other women who had shared the same night, the same exhaustion, the same impossible secret, were making the exact same walk. They could not tell anyone else what they carried, but they could, at least, carry it together. For 30 years after the war, the story of Bletchley Park existed publicly as almost nothing at all. The estate had been quietly dismantled, its huts emptied, its remarkable machines largely destroyed on government order, their revolutionary engineering considered too sensitive to preserve even in memory. The thousands of women who had worked there went on with their lives, raised families, took ordinary jobs, grew old, and said nothing because nothing had ever formally released them from the promise they made at 18 or 19. The unraveling began slowly, almost accidentally, in the mid-1970s. A historian named Brian Randall had been quietly lobbying the British government for permission to write about the code-breaking machines developed during the war, and in 1975, that permission finally arrived in a limited form. The government began releasing a small number of photographs, along with cautious permission for Randall to interview some of the engineers who had built the Colossus machines, though even then, he was instructed not to discuss the actual code-breaking the machines had made possible. It was a narrow crack in a door that had been sealed for 3 decades, but it was a crack nonetheless, and it was the first light many of these women had seen fall on their wartime work in their entire adult lives. Once that crack opened, it widened slowly, over years and then decades, as historians, journalists, and eventually the women's own children and grandchildren began asking the questions that had never been permitted before. Researchers combing through partial records and fragmentary official mentions began the painstaking work of simply trying to establish who exactly had worked at Bletchley Park at all, since so much of the personnel documentation had either been destroyed or never properly preserved in the first place. One researcher, digging specifically into the women's contributions, started with roughly 20 names pulled from scattered sources and, cross-referencing them patiently against surviving Bletchley Park records, eventually identified nearly 80 women whose wartime work could finally be documented and, in some small way, honored. 80 names, recovered after decades of searching, out of a wartime workforce of women that had numbered in the thousands. It is worth sitting with that gap for a moment, the enormous distance between how many of these women actually did this work, and how few of their names survived clearly enough in the historical record to be recovered at all. Most of them remain, even now, essentially anonymous, present in group photographs without captions, mentioned in passing in official reports as simply staff or personnel, their individual contributions folded into an institutional achievement credited in the public imagination almost entirely to a small handful of men. A similar process unfolded across the Atlantic decades later when a journalist named Liza Mundy began tracking down the surviving American codebreakers for a book that would eventually be published under the title Code Girls. By the time she started her research, most of these women were in their 80s and 90s, and many of the youngest recruits from 1942 had already died without ever telling their families what they had done during the war. Mundy managed to interview 20 of the surviving codebreakers directly, though even then, decades after the information had been formally declassified, some of them remained visibly hesitant to speak, uncertain, even in their 90s, whether they were truly free to describe what they had once been forbidden even to name. One of these women, a codebreaker named Jane Cos-Braden, took her secrecy oath in what is now a building at Arlington Hall, decades before it was repurposed once again, this time into a training facility for American diplomats. When researchers finally located her, she was, in Mundy's own account, not entirely convinced that she was free to tell her story, even though she also, quite clearly, wanted very much to tell it. For 70 years, she had carried the knowledge of what she had done without receiving any of the recognition that knowledge might have earned her had it simply been allowed to exist in the open. At Oak Ridge, the process of rediscovery took a slightly different shape, driven in part by a book called The Girls of Atomic City, which set out to document the social history of the women who had built and staffed the secret city during the war. Its author gathered surviving oral histories, tracked down photographs, and pieced together, house by house and dormitory by dormitory, a portrait of a community that had existed almost entirely outside the visible historical record, a town that had housed tens of thousands of people and appeared for years on no public map at all. What emerges from all of this recovered material, patient and partial as it necessarily is not a single dramatic revelation, but something closer to a slow accumulation of small, individually modest facts, each one insisting quietly on being remembered. A woman who monitored a dial without knowing what it measured. A woman who cracked a Japanese diplomatic cipher and told no one for the rest of her working life. A woman who described her own war work to curious relatives for 30 straight years as simply secretarial because that was the only true sentence she had ever been permitted to say. There is something particularly poignant about the timing of much of this recovery work, arriving as it so often did in the final years of these women's lives, sometimes literally in their 90s, sometimes only after they had already died and left their families to piece together the truth from newspaper clippings and declassified documents. Recognition, when it finally came, often came too late for the women themselves to fully enjoy it, though it mattered enormously to the families who finally understood, decades later, exactly what their mothers and grandmothers had quietly carried through an entire lifetime of ordinary, unremarkable-seeming days. And still, even now, the recovery remains incomplete. For every codebreaker whose name has been carefully documented, for every Calutron operator whose oral history has been recorded and preserved, there are hundreds, likely thousands, whose names simply did not survive in any retrievable form. Women who lived and worked and kept their silence and died, taking the last, complete version of their own story with them. History, in this particular case, did not forget them through carelessness. It forgot them because forgetting was, quite literally, the job they had been asked to do. It helps, sometimes, to slow all the way down and sit with just a few of these women individually, rather than moving quickly across the whole enormous scale of what happened. Numbers in the thousands are difficult for any mind to hold on to with real feeling. A single life, described slowly enough, tends to stay with you longer. Consider Mavis Beatty, still only in her early 20s during her years at Bletchley Park. She had originally hoped to study German literature at university, drawn to the language for reasons that had nothing to do with war or espionage, simply an interest in poetry and prose. The war rerouted that interest entirely, placing her instead in front of encrypted Italian naval communications, where her patient linguistic instincts proved unexpectedly suited to the work of cryptanalysis. In one particular breakthrough, she decoded a message that revealed the precise date of a planned Italian naval attack, intelligence that allowed the Royal Navy to prepare and ultimately secure one of the more decisive naval victories of the Mediterranean campaign. Decades later, recalling those years for an interviewer, she described the whole experience with a kind of wry understatement. Everything was quite mad, really, she said, the sentence carrying, in its brevity, an entire universe of things she still was not fully inclined to elaborate on. Consider Joan Clark, who arrived at Bletchley in 1940 carrying a double first in mathematics from Cambridge, an achievement the university itself would not at that time formally recognise with a full degree because she was a woman. She was assigned to Hut 8, the section devoted to attacking German naval codes, work of enormous consequence for the Atlantic convoys carrying food, fuel and troops across waters patrolled by German submarines hunting for exactly this kind of vulnerable traffic. Her mathematical talent placed her, functionally, among the most capable cryptanalysts in the entire operation, working alongside men whose names would later become far more widely known than her own, for reasons that had considerably more to do with the era's assumptions about gender than with any real difference in the value of their contributions. Consider Margaret Rock, whose work on German and Russian ciphers earned her a private but unusually specific compliment from Dilly Knox, a veteran cryptanalyst who had helped decode messages in the previous World War. He described her, in terms that history has only recently begun to properly credit, as among the 4 or 5 sharpest minds working the Enigma problem in the entire building. It is worth noting how rarely that kind of praise made its way into any public account of the war's code-breaking effort, buried instead in private correspondence and internal assessments that took decades to surface. Consider Eleanor Ireland, one of the 273 women trained to operate the Colossus machines, the earliest electronic digital computers ever built, doing work so sensitive that she did not learn the actual name of the machine she operated for 30 years. When friends and relatives asked what she had done during the war, She gave them the same rehearsed sentence over and over for 3 decades. "We were to say that we did secretarial work," she later explained, a small, precise phrase that had shaped how an entire community understood her for the better part of her adult life. Consider Gladys Owens, one of the young women recruited straight out of high school to operate the Calutrons at Oak Ridge. She remembered, with particular clarity, the exact words a manager used when addressing her training group for the first time. "We can train you how to do what is needed," he told them, "but we cannot tell you what you are doing. All I can tell you is that if our enemies beat us to it, God have mercy on us all." She carried that sentence with her, unable for years to fully understand what it had actually meant until the news broke in August of 1945 of what her careful, patient work at those dials had ultimately helped to build. Consider Ruth Huddleston, another of the Calutron girls who remembered being told just as plainly exactly what boundaries her new job required. "What you learn here and what you do here stays here," she was told. "Don't tell your family. Don't tell your friends. All you need to know is that you're helping to end the war." She lived by that instruction for the rest of the war and beyond. One voice among 10,000 young women asked to accept an almost unbearable degree of trust without any accompanying explanation. Consider a young Tennessee woman known in the historical record simply as Dot, who spent her nights watching a single dial, keeping a needle centered through a training process she later described as fairly simple given the complexity of the machine beneath it. Keep the needle in the center. If it drifts right, turn this knob left. If it drifts left, turn the opposite knob right. If it sparks, call the supervisor. She admitted, decades later, that guessing at the larger purpose of all this careful attention had been almost impossible to resist for anyone living inside those fences, and yet she had done the disciplined, patient work regardless, night after night, without ever being given the satisfaction of an answer until the whole world learned it at once. Consider Genevieve Grotjan, working through American intercepts of Japanese diplomatic traffic at Arlington Hall, whose careful attention to a recurring pattern led directly to a breakthrough in cracking the purple cipher, one of the most consequential achievements of the entire American code-breaking effort during the war. Her discovery shaped intelligence assessments that reached the highest levels of American wartime leadership, and yet her name remained, for decades afterward, essentially unknown outside a small circle of intelligence professionals. Consider Anne Cara Christie, whose earliest task at Arlington Hall involved simply sorting through enormous volumes of intercepted traffic, tedious, repetitive labor that she later admitted had tested her patience considerably more than her intellect, at least in the beginning. She would go on, almost uniquely among her wartime colleagues, to build a long and genuinely distinguished post-war career in American intelligence, eventually rising into senior leadership at the National Security Agency, a rare instance of one of these women's wartime competence translating directly into lasting professional recognition. Consider, finally, a Canadian wren named Jean Tackerberry, who served at Bletchley Park and, like so many of her colleagues, kept the details of her wartime work private for the rest of her life. Decades later, the daughter of one of her fellow wrens, a woman who had been only 10 years old when her own mother died, sought out Tackerberry specifically in the hope of finally understanding what her mother's secret wartime service had actually involved. Tackerberry agreed to speak with her, helping to fill in gaps in a story that had, for the daughter, remained frustratingly incomplete for 48 years, since the day her mother had died, still carrying most of it silently inside her. Each of these women, described slowly enough, becomes something more than a statistic in a much larger accounting of wartime labor. They become briefly, individually knowable, each with a specific voice, a specific memory, a specific sentence they carried through the rest of their lives. And for every woman whose name and story survived clearly enough to be told this way, there remain hundreds more whose individual voices simply did not make it through the decades of silence intact. Women who are present in this story only as part of a number, a workforce, a percentage of a much larger, largely anonymous whole. By now, a shape has probably started to become visible across these 3 very different places, 3 very different kinds of secret work, 3 very different countries organizing their wartime intelligence and industry in 3 very different ways. It is worth naming that shape plainly because it did not happen by coincidence, and understanding why it happened tells us something important about the era these women lived through. In each case, a labor shortage created by the war opened a door that had previously been closed. Men who would ordinarily have filled these roles, university-trained mathematicians, career scientists, career military intelligence officers, were needed elsewhere, on battlefields and in cockpits and aboard ships, and the work still had to get done. Governments on both sides of the Atlantic turned, somewhat reluctantly and somewhat out of pure necessity, to a labor pool they had spent decades systematically excluding from serious professional and technical work: women. And in each case, something interesting happened once that door opened. The women who walked through it did not merely fill a gap adequately, they frequently outperformed the assumptions built into the systems that had excluded them for so long. The Calitron girls at Oak Ridge outperformed trained physicists at the exact task those physicists had been specifically educated to handle. Margaret Rock was assessed by a veteran cryptanalyst as among the very best minds working the Enigma problem. Full stop, not merely among the best women working it. Genevieve Grotjan's breakthrough on the purple cipher stands as one of the genuinely pivotal moments of American wartime cryptanalysis, regardless of gender. This is worth sitting with directly because it complicates a story that could otherwise be told comfortably as simply about wartime necessity and post-war gratitude. These were not women being given a chance out of the goodness of anyone's heart, temporarily filling in until the men could return to their rightful places. These were women whose competence, once given even a narrow, secretive opportunity to demonstrate itself, turned out to be equal to or greater than the competence of the men whose exclusive claim to this kind of work had never actually been earned through demonstrated superiority. It had simply never been tested. And then, just as consistently across all three institutions, that demonstrated competence was allowed to disappear the moment it was no longer strictly necessary. The doors that had opened under wartime pressure closed again almost as quickly once the pressure lifted, not because the women's skills had evaporated, but because the underlying assumptions about where women belonged in professional and technical life had never actually been revised. The war had created an exception. It had not created a lasting change in how these societies thought about what women were capable of. The secrecy itself compounded this erasure in a particularly cruel way. In an ordinary circumstance, extraordinary wartime achievement might have provided at least some leverage against post-war assumptions, a body of proven, demonstrable competence that could be pointed to, argued from, built upon. But because almost none of this work could be discussed publicly, that leverage simply did not exist. A woman could not explain, in a 1946 job interview, that she had helped crack a naval cipher that saved Atlantic convoys, because doing so would have been, quite literally, a criminal act. The very secrecy that had made these women's contributions possible in the first place also made those contributions almost entirely useless to them once the war that required them had ended. There is a broader context worth mentioning here as well, one that reaches slightly beyond the three institutions at the center of tonight's story. Women's wartime intelligence work was not limited to Bletchley Park, Oak Ridge, and Arlington Hall alone. Elsewhere in Britain, women served as agents for the Special Operations Executive, parachuting into occupied Europe to work alongside resistance networks, carrying out sabotage and intelligence-gathering missions under constant risk of capture, torture, and execution, their identities and operations classified for decades after the war on grounds of ongoing intelligence value. In the United States, women flying with the Women Air Force Service pilots ferried military aircraft across the country, freeing male pilots for combat duty, only to find their own military status denied and unrecognized for over 30 years after the war ended, a bureaucratic erasure not entirely unlike the secrecy erasure faced by the Codebreakers and Calitron operators. Across all of these overlapping stories, a single pattern keeps repeating itself with an almost eerie consistency. Wartime necessity opens a door. Women prove, decisively and repeatedly, that they belonged on the other side of that door all along. And then, once the necessity passes, the door closes again, and the proof of their competence is either classified into silence, bureaucratically denied, or simply left uncelebrated, allowed to fade quietly out of public memory while a smaller, more conventional cast of male figures absorbs the credit for what an entire hidden workforce actually accomplished. None of this diminishes what these women did. If anything, understanding the pattern makes their individual achievements feel even more remarkable because it clarifies just how little institutional support or public recognition any of them could have expected, even in the moment, even while the work was actively shortening a war and saving countless lives. They did not do this work for the promise of future recognition. Most of them understood from the very first day, reading and signing whatever version of the secrecy oath their particular institution required, that recognition was never going to be part of the arrangement. They did the work anyway, carefully, patiently, night after night, because it needed doing, and because they had been asked, and because, in the middle of an enormous global catastrophe, doing something that mattered, even silently, even anonymously, was its own kind of answer to an otherwise unbearable historical moment. There is a particular kind of historical labor involved in trying to reconstruct a story that was quite deliberately built to leave almost no trace behind, and it is worth understanding a little of what that labor actually looks like, because it explains why so much of tonight's story arrives to us in fragments rather than a single continuous account. Personnel records from wartime intelligence operations were often destroyed on purpose, either immediately after the war or in later decades, as part of routine security procedures that treated even the existence of a comprehensive staff list as a potential vulnerability. A researcher trying to establish, decades later, exactly who worked in a given hut at Bletchley Park or a given division at Arlington Hall frequently finds nothing more than fragments. A payroll ledger with initials instead of full names, a photograph with no caption, a passing mention in someone else's memoir, a single sentence in a letter that survived only because a family happened to keep it in an attic for 70 years. Piecing together even a partial roster, then, becomes an exercise closer to archaeology than conventional historical research. A name surfaces in one source. A researcher cross-references it against a scattered handful of other partial records, a wartime photograph, a surviving ration card, a brief mention in an official report that used only a surname and an initial. Slowly, painstakingly, a single confirmed identity emerges from what had been, moments before, simply an anonymous face in a group photograph or an uncredited hand visible at the edge of a control panel. This is, in its own way, a form of night work too, though it happens decades after the fact in university archives and museum research rooms rather than in wartime huts and control rooms. Historians and archivists, working through box after box of fragmentary material, are essentially conducting a long, patient act of restoration, trying to give back to these women something that was deliberately taken from them at the time, a documented, attributable place in the historical record of what actually happened during the war. The gaps that remain, even after decades of this careful work, are genuinely enormous. Of the nearly 9,000 people who worked at Bletchley Park at its peak, 3/4 of them women, only a small fraction have been individually identified and documented with any real detail. Of the roughly 10,000 women who monitored the calatrons at Oak Ridge, most exist in the historical record only as an aggregate statistic, a number in a government report, rather than as named individuals whose specific stories can be told. Of the 7,000 women who worked at Arlington Hall, the vast majority remain even now essentially anonymous, their individual contributions absorbed entirely into a single collective description. American Codebreakers, American cryptanalysts, without further specificity attached to most of the names involved. It would be easy to treat this incompleteness as simply an unfortunate byproduct of wartime security procedures, an unavoidable side effect of protecting genuinely sensitive information during a genuinely dangerous global conflict. There is truth in that framing. But it is also worth noticing how the incompleteness falls unevenly across the historical record. How much more thoroughly documented the men in these same institutions tend to be, relative to the women who, in most cases, vastly outnumbered them. Alan Turing's wartime work is documented in extraordinary, granular detail, down to specific dates and specific technical decisions. The work of the thousands of women who operated the machines his theoretical breakthroughs made possible survives, for the most part, only in aggregate, in percentages, in vague institutional descriptions that rarely bother to specify who, exactly, was sitting at which machine on which particular night. This unevenness reflects something beyond simple wartime security practice. It reflects the broader assumptions of the era about whose contributions were considered worth carefully documenting in the first place, and whose contributions were treated as interchangeable, replaceable, not worth the additional administrative effort of precise attribution. A brilliant male cryptanalyst's specific insights were worth recording for posterity. A competent female machine operator, however essential her steady, reliable attention actually was to the entire operation functioning correctly, was often recorded only as one interchangeable unit among many, her individual identity considered implicitly less historically significant. Researchers working to correct this imbalance today face a race against time that grows more urgent with each passing year. The women who lived through this history directly, who could still, as recently as a decade or two ago, offer first-hand testimony about their specific experiences, are almost entirely gone now. The youngest recruits from 1942, 18 or 19 years old at the time, would be well past their 90th birthdays today, if they are still living at all. Every oral history successfully recorded in recent decades represents, in a very real sense, one of the last opportunities to hear these stories directly from the women who lived them, rather than reconstructing them second-hand from fragmentary written records. This is part of why tonight's story matters as more than simple historical curiosity. Every time a name like Eleanor Ireland or Gladys Owens or Genevieve Grotjan or Ruth Huddleston is spoken aloud, remembered, placed carefully back into its proper historical context, it represents a small act of restoration, a partial undoing of the deliberate anonymity these women were asked to accept as the price of their wartime service. It does not undo the original erasure. It cannot restore the recognition they were denied during their own lifetimes, in most cases. But it can at least ensure that the erasure does not continue indefinitely, that the record, however incomplete, grows a little more accurate and a little more honest with each passing year of patient, careful research. Inside the fence that surrounded Oak Ridge, keeping the entire secret city sealed off from the outside world, there was, for the roughly 7,000 African American workers who lived and labored there during the war, a second fence entirely. One that most histories of the Manhattan Project mention only in passing, if they mention it at all. Black workers were drawn to Oak Ridge for many of the same reasons white workers were: the promise of steady wartime wages considerably higher than most could earn at home, and a chance to contribute something meaningful to a war that touched every family in the country. Catty Strickland, who took a job as a janitor at the K-25 gaseous diffusion plant while it was still under construction, later remembered the simple, honest pleasure of that first paycheck. "I thought I was rich," she said. "All that money." But the wages arrived bound to conditions that made clear, in the plainest possible terms, exactly where the segregated South's ordinary cruelties would and would not bend, even inside a facility devoted to the most advanced scientific undertaking in human history. Housing at Oak Ridge was rigidly divided by race, and for black residents that meant 16-foot square plywood structures called hutments, 4 to 6 occupants crammed into a single room with a solitary oil stove for heat and no plumbing of any kind. White hutments existed too, in smaller numbers and marginally less crowded, but for black families arriving at Oak Ridge, the hutment was, in practical terms, the only housing option available, regardless of the skill or seniority of the work they had been hired to do. The cruelty extended further still. Married black couples were not permitted to live together. Catty Strickland's husband worked and lived elsewhere in Oak Ridge, and the two of them were kept apart by a policy that applied to no white married couple in the entire settlement. The women's hutment area sat behind its own barbed wire fence, an enclosure the residents themselves came to call, with a kind of grim, weary humour, the pen. Guards stood watch at its entrance, ostensibly for the women's protection, enforcing a strict curfew and conducting bed checks that could come unannounced at any hour of the night. Catty Strickland and her husband had also been told, before they ever arrived, that their children would not be permitted to live with them at Oak Ridge at all. The couple made the difficult decision to leave their children behind in Alabama with their grandmother for the duration of the war, sending money home as regularly as they could manage, carrying the particular ache of that separation alongside all the other ordinary burdens of wartime life. Recreation and daily necessities were segregated with the same rigor as housing. Restrooms, water fountains, dining facilities, and social spaces were all kept strictly divided by race, in keeping with the Jim Crow laws that governed the surrounding region regardless of the federal government's presence. A single recreation hall served the entire black community at Oak Ridge, a modest structure equipped with little more than a few checkerboards, a worn piano, a volleyball net, and outdated films shown only twice a week, while white residents enjoyed multiple newly built movie theaters running fresh pictures daily. A journalist who documented these disparities after the war, writing for the Chicago Defender, described the plight of black residents at Oak Ridge as among the most wretched anywhere in the segregated South, a striking claim about a place that was, simultaneously, the site of one of the most technologically advanced projects in human history. And yet, inside this deeply unequal system, black women and men still contributed meaningfully to the work of Oak Ridge, largely in janitorial, custodial, and construction roles, rather than the more visible Calutron operating positions filled almost exclusively by white women. Their labor kept the enormous, sprawling facility functioning, cleaning the buildings, maintaining the grounds, performing the unglamorous daily work that any operation of this scale required, all while being denied even the most basic dignities the war effort claimed officially to be fighting for. A parallel, though notably different, pattern unfolded at Arlington Hall, where the Army maintained a segregated but genuinely integrated code-breaking operation, assigning a unit of African American women and men to analyze commercial intelligence, tracking which companies and individuals maintained business relationships with Axis powers. This unit's existence reflected pressure applied at senior levels of the wartime administration to ensure some measure of black participation in the war's intelligence apparatus, a decision that stood in sharp contrast to the Navy's own code-breaking operation, which excluded black women from cryptanalytic work entirely, even after the Navy finally admitted African American women into its WAVES program in the war's final months. The women of this Arlington Hall unit performed genuinely significant intelligence analysis, tracking financial and commercial networks that connected ostensibly neutral businesses to the Axis war effort, work requiring the same patient, meticulous attention as any other form of wartime cryptanalysis. And like their white colleagues elsewhere in the building, their individual names and specific contributions have survived only sparsely in the historical record, doubly obscured, first by the same blanket wartime secrecy that silenced every codebreaker regardless of race, and second by a broader historical pattern of simply failing to document black women's contributions to major American institutions with the same care afforded to their white counterparts. It is worth holding both of these facts together without flattening one into the other. The war did, in real and measurable ways, open doors for black women and men that had previously been closed, offering wages and forms of participation in national life that peacetime employment had rarely made available. And the war simultaneously replicated and enforced, with barbed wire and separate bathhouses and forced family separation, the exact same racial hierarchy these workers had hoped, at least briefly, to leave behind. Both things were true at the same time, inside the very same fences that were, at that moment, helping to build a weapon meant to end a war fought, at least in its stated ideals, against exactly this kind of systemic cruelty. For the women who had spent 2 years watching dials at Oak Ridge without ever being told what those dials measured, the morning of August 6, 1945, arrived like the sudden, disorienting resolution of a question they had learned, slowly and reluctantly, to stop asking. Newspapers across the country carried the story of a new kind of weapon, dropped on a Japanese city called Hiroshima, powerful enough to end the war in a single stroke. And somewhere in the details of those reports, quietly, almost as an afterthought to the enormity of the event itself, came confirmation of what the uranium inside that weapon had required and where a significant portion of it had been prepared. It is difficult from this distance to fully reconstruct what that morning actually felt like for the thousands of young women who read those headlines and understood for the first time the true shape of what their careful, patient work had been building toward. Some later described a kind of vindication, a rush of pride at discovering that their years of disciplined attention had mattered as much as, or more than, they had allowed themselves to imagine. Others described something closer to a quiet unease, a slower, more complicated reckoning with the knowledge that their hands, in some indirect but undeniable way, had helped produce a weapon capable of the destruction now being reported in every newspaper in the country. Both reactions, and everything in between them, were entirely reasonable responses to an almost impossible piece of information to absorb all at once. These were, for the most part, young women in their late teens and early 20s, raised in small towns and rural communities, who had spent 2 years being told, repeatedly and with total seriousness, that their silent, careful work mattered enormously to the war effort. And now, in a single morning, the abstract weight of that reassurance had suddenly acquired a specific, concrete, and genuinely staggering shape. One woman, reflecting decades later on that particular morning, offered a sentence that has stayed with many of the historians who have since interviewed survivors of this era. She said simply that she still thought about it, a spare, understated admission that nonetheless carries an enormous amount of unspoken weight. There is no dramatic flourish in that sentence, no attempt to resolve the complicated feelings it gestures toward into something tidier or more comfortable. It simply acknowledges that the morning of August 6th, 1945, left something behind that never fully settled, even across the following decades of an otherwise ordinary life. At Bletchley Park and Arlington Hall, the end of the war brought a different, though related, kind of reckoning. The intelligence these women had gathered, decoded, and analysed for years had shaped outcomes across every theatre of the war, from the survival of Atlantic convoys to the precise timing of major military operations to the location of enemy fleets in the Pacific. And yet, unlike the Oak Ridge workers, whose contribution became publicly visible in a single dramatic instant, the Codebreakers' work remained entirely invisible even as victory was formally declared. There was no newspaper headline confirming what they had done. There was, for most of them, simply the war ending, the huts and offices slowly emptying, and the same silence that had governed their working lives now extending indefinitely into peacetime, with no clear moment of public acknowledgement ever arriving at all. This asymmetry is worth pausing on. The Oak Ridge workers, whatever complicated feelings the bomb's use provoked in them, at least received a single, unmistakable morning in which the significance of their labor became publicly, undeniably real. The Codebreakers received nothing comparable, no morning newspaper confirming what their years of night shifts had actually accomplished, only an ongoing, unbroken silence that would, for many of them, persist for the rest of their lives. Their victory, unlike the victory in the Pacific, never received its own headline. For the Calutron girls, in the months that followed August 1945, an entirely new kind of adjustment began, one that involved reconciling the small, repetitive, patient labor of watching a single dial with the almost unimaginable scale of what that labor had ultimately produced. Many of them, interviewed decades later by researchers and documentarians, described a lingering difficulty in fully connecting those two things, the modest, concrete daily reality of their work and the world-altering consequence it had helped bring about. It is one thing to understand, intellectually, that your work mattered to the war effort. It is another thing entirely to watch a headline confirm that your work helped build a weapon capable of ending a city, and to spend the rest of your life holding both of those truths simultaneously, without the benefit of ever having chosen consciously to participate in exactly this outcome. Some of the women who lived through Oak Ridge later became advocates, in their own quiet ways, for greater public understanding of nuclear history, participating in oral history projects, speaking to researchers, helping to ensure that the complicated moral weight of their wartime experience did not simply disappear along with their generation. Others preferred, for the rest of their lives, to say very little about it at all, treating the entire episode as a closed chapter they had no particular wish to reopen, even once the secrecy that had once legally required their silence no longer applied. There is no single correct way to have carried what these women carried, and it would be a disservice to flatten their individual and often deeply personal responses into a single tidy conclusion. What can be said, honestly and without overreaching, is that the morning the secret finally became public was not, for most of them, a simple moment of celebration. It was the beginning of a far longer and more complicated process of understanding exactly what they had done, a process some of them were still working through, quietly, 70 and 80 years later, in the final interviews they gave before their own long lives came to an end. If you were to travel to Bletchley Park today, you would find it transformed into something its wartime occupants could scarcely have imagined. A museum carefully restored, its huts reopened not as secret intelligence facilities but as public exhibition spaces, walked through daily by visitors who come specifically to learn what once could not be spoken aloud on pain of prosecution. The bomber machines have been painstakingly rebuilt from surviving diagrams and the recollections of the engineers who once maintained them. A working reconstruction of Colossus, the same machine some of its own operators did not learn the name of for 30 years, now runs quietly in a room where visitors can watch its mechanisms cycle through calculations that once helped shorten a war. The Bletchley Park Trust, which now maintains the site, has spent considerable effort in recent years specifically correcting the historical records long imbalanced toward the men of the estate, commissioning new research, collecting new oral histories, and working directly with institutions like Newnham College to recover the names and stories of women whose contributions were, for decades, folded silently into an institutional achievement credited almost entirely to a handful of famous mathematicians. It is slow, careful, ongoing work, an active correction still very much in progress rather than a completed act of historical justice. Oak Ridge has undergone its own version of this transformation. The secret city that once appeared on no public map is now formally recognized as part of the Manhattan Project National Historical Park, its former hutments, laboratories, and control rooms preserved and interpreted for visitors who come specifically to understand both the scientific achievement and the human cost, including the segregation that governed daily life behind those wartime fences. The Calitron control panels the young women once monitored, night after night, without understanding what they measured, are now museum pieces, displayed with the full historical context their original operators were never permitted to know. At Arlington Hall, the transformation carried its own particular symbolic weight. The campus that had once trained young women in the etiquette expected of polite society before being seized for the deadly serious business of wartime cryptanalysis is now home to the Foreign Service Institute, the training ground for American diplomats. In recent years, the Institute has taken specific steps to honor the Codebreakers who once worked within its walls, hosting recognition ceremonies and researching the specific contributions of women like Jen Cos Braden, whose secrecy oath was administered in a building that now trains an entirely different generation of Americans for entirely different, though still consequential, work in service of the country. Books have played their own significant role in this slow process of recovery. Liza Mundy's Code Girls brought the story of the American Codebreakers to a wide popular audience for the first time, drawing directly on interviews with the last living survivors of that generation before their voices were lost entirely. Denise Kiernan's The Girls of Atomic City did comparable work for the women of Oak Ridge, weaving together oral history, archival research, and social history into a portrait of a community that had existed essentially in the historical shadows for 70 years. Neither book could fully close the gaps left by decades of enforced silence and destroyed records, but each one made those gaps considerably smaller and considerably more visible to a public that had, for the most part, simply never known these gaps existed in the first place. There is a particular kind of satisfaction in knowing that this recovery work continues even now, that researchers, archivists, and historians are still in this very year combing through fragmentary records, still tracking down the last surviving relatives of women who kept their wartime silence all the way to their graves, still adding new names to rosters that will, in all likelihood, never be fully complete. It is unglamorous, patient work, not unlike the work these women themselves performed night after night in huts and control rooms and converted classrooms across 2 countries. There is something quietly fitting in that resemblance. And yet, for all of this progress, the fundamental asymmetry described earlier in tonight's story has never been fully corrected, and it is worth being honest about that rather than closing on an overly tidy note. Alan Turing has a statue, a biopic, a place in popular culture secure enough that his name has become nearly synonymous with the entire code-breaking effort at Bletchley Park. The 7,000 women who made up 3/4 of that same workforce do not collectively occupy anything close to that same space in public memory, despite performing work that was, in aggregate, at least as consequential to the war's outcome. Recognition, when it finally arrives for a story like this one, tends to arrive unevenly, in fragments, decades late, and never quite proportional to what was actually done. What can honestly be said is that the direction of travel, however slow, however incomplete, is toward greater recognition rather than away from it. Each new oral history recorded, each new museum exhibit that specifically foregrounds the women's contributions, rather than treating them as an undifferentiated backdrop to a handful of famous men, each new book that reaches a slightly wider audience, represents genuine, if modest, progress against 70 years of near-total silence. It does not undo what these women were asked to give up. It does at least ensure that what they gave will not disappear entirely, that some version of their story will continue to be told. carefully, patiently, to audiences who were never alive to witness the original silence these women were made to keep. Tonight's story has centered on three particular institutions, chosen because their records happen to be, relatively speaking, among the better documented examples of this pattern. But it would be a mistake to imagine that the pattern was somehow limited to just these three places. Similar quiet rooms existed across the entire Allied war effort, each with its own version of the same essential arrangement. Women doing consequential, often dangerous work, sworn to silence, and largely written out of the histories that followed. In occupied Europe, women recruited by Britain's Special Operations Executive parachuted behind enemy lines to work alongside resistance networks, carrying out sabotage operations, relaying intelligence, and, in some cases, paying for that work with their lives. Their operations remained classified for decades after the war, protected not merely by wartime secrecy but by the ongoing sensitivity of intelligence methods that intelligence agencies considered relevant well into the Cold War. Some of these women were captured, interrogated, and executed by occupying forces, their specific fates unknown to their own families for years, sometimes decades, after the war had ended. In Canada, women serving as wrens worked at British Commonwealth intelligence stations, contributing to the same code-breaking effort underway at Bletchley Park, their service similarly bound by the Official Secrets Act and similarly absent from most popular accounts of the war. One of them, a woman named Jean Tackerberry, kept her wartime service private for the rest of her life, only agreeing decades later to help fill in the gaps for the daughter of a fellow wren who had died without ever explaining her own secret service to her own child. In the United States, beyond the Codebreakers and Calutron operators, women flying with the Women Air Force service pilots ferried military aircraft across the country and towed targets for live anti-aircraft gunnery practice, dangerous, essential work that freed male pilots for combat duty overseas. 38 of these women died in service to their country, and yet the United States government did not grant them formal military status, or the benefits and recognition that came with it, until more than 3 decades after the war had ended. A different kind of erasure than the Codebreakers experienced, but one that emerged from a strikingly similar unwillingness to fully credit women's wartime contributions once the immediate necessity had passed. Even within the more visible and widely celebrated wartime image of women stepping into industrial labor, the version now remembered through the popular figure of Rosie the Riveter, there existed quieter, less publicized layers of women's contribution that never made it into the recruitment posters at all. Women working in classified aircraft design departments, women analyzing weather patterns for bombing raid planning, women serving in intelligence-adjacent roles scattered across dozens of smaller, less famous installations, each one contributing some small, essential piece to an enormous collective effort that the post-war world would remember almost entirely through its most visible and most male participants. The pattern, once you begin looking for it, becomes difficult to unsee. It appears in slightly different forms across nearly every Allied nation that fought in the war, across nearly every category of consequential wartime labor that required discretion, patience, and sustained attention under pressure. Women were trusted with the work. Women were asked to accept silence as the price of that trust. And when the war ended, the trust rarely converted into lasting recognition, while the silence, in many cases, persisted for decades beyond any reasonable security justification. It would be tidy, and perhaps comforting, to describe this as an unfortunate historical accident, a simple byproduct of wartime necessity that nobody specifically intended. The evidence suggests something closer to a pattern reinforced, again and again, by an era's deeply held assumptions about which contributions deserve to be remembered and which could reasonably be allowed to fade. Understanding this pattern does not require assigning malicious intent to any single individual or institution. It requires simply noticing how consistently the outcome repeated itself across different countries, different kinds of work, and different decades until the repetition itself becomes the story worth telling. There is a phrase worth returning to now, the same phrase that opened tonight's story. Officially, they weren't there. It is worth sitting with exactly what that phrase means and what it cost before we let the evening settle into its final, quieter hours. To be officially absent from your own history is a strange and particular kind of erasure, different in character from simply being forgotten. Forgetting happens by accident, through the ordinary passage of time, through records lost to fire or flood or simple neglect. What happened to these women was not an accident. It was a deliberate, carefully constructed condition of their employment, built into the very paperwork they signed before they were permitted to begin their first shift. They were asked, quite literally, to become invisible in exchange for the privilege of doing meaningful, difficult, consequential work during one of the most significant events in human history. And they accepted that condition, almost universally, without extensive protest, because the alternative, in the context of a global war whose outcome remained genuinely uncertain for years, felt unthinkable to most of them. What good would complaining about anonymity do when the war itself still hung in the balance, when brothers and husbands and neighbors were dying in numbers too large to properly comprehend, when the entire structure of ordinary life had been suspended indefinitely in service of something larger than any individual's need for recognition? They signed the papers. They kept the silence. They did the work. What makes their story worth telling now, decades later, is not simply that the work was impressive, though it certainly was. It is that the silence itself, examined closely, reveals something important about how societies decide whose contributions are worth remembering in the first place. The men who led these operations, who theorized the mathematical approaches, who oversaw the engineering, were, for the most part, eventually recognized, sometimes during their own lifetimes, for what they accomplished. The women who executed that work, night after night, with a discipline and competence that repeatedly exceeded expectations, were asked to disappear into a collective, anonymous mass, their individual competence rarely singled out for the kind of attention their male colleagues routinely received. This is not a story that ends with a simple villain to blame or a clean resolution to offer. The secrecy that silenced these women was, in many cases, genuinely necessary in the moment, protecting operational methods that, if revealed, could have cost lives and altered the outcome of the war. The tragedy is not that the secrecy existed. The tragedy is how long it was allowed to persist past the point of genuine necessity, and how completely the post-war world failed to make room for these women's competence and contribution once the specific secrets themselves no longer required protection. We began tonight with a single signature, a young woman's name on a document that promised, under threat of prosecution, that she would carry a secret for the rest of her life. We have spent these hours trying to understand what stood behind that signature, the recruitment that brought her there, the specific work she was asked to perform, the daily texture of her nights, the silence she carried home to a family who never fully knew her, the post-war world that asked her to simply set the whole experience aside and resume an ordinary life. We have tried, as much as the surviving fragments of the historical record allow, to give some shape and specificity to a story that was, quite deliberately, designed to have almost none. Somewhere, right now, in an archive or a family attic or a box of letters nobody has opened in decades, there is very likely a fragment of one more story like the ones we have told tonight, waiting for someone patient enough to notice it, cross-reference it, and carry it carefully back into the light. That is, in its own small way, the quiet, ongoing work of undoing what these women were asked to do to themselves. Not dramatic, not sudden, simply patient, careful, and continued, in the same spirit the women themselves brought to their own long-forgotten night shifts. It would be easy, telling a story like this one, to make every single night sound dramatic, every shift charged with the tension of history in the making. That would not be honest. The overwhelming majority of the hours these women worked were not dramatic at all. They were simply long and quiet and repetitive, filled with small, unremarkable tasks performed correctly over and over, because correctness, sustained patiently across thousands of hours, was exactly what the work required. A bomb operator at Bletchley might spend an entire 8-hour shift doing little more than feeding settings into a machine, recording results, and resetting the drums to try again, the work broken only by the occasional cup of tea carried around on a trolley by another tired woman working the same strange hours. A Calutron operator at Oak Ridge might spend her whole night simply watching a single needle, making small adjustments, filling in a log at the top of each hour, the silence broken only by the low electrical hum of the machine and the occasional footsteps of a supervisor making his rounds. A codebreaker at Arlington Hall might spend her night sorting through hundreds of intercepted messages, searching for a single repeated pattern among thousands of characters that meant nothing at all on their own. This ordinariness is, in its own way, one of the more remarkable aspects of the whole story. These women were not, for the most part, having thrilling adventures in the way wartime fiction sometimes imagines. They were doing something closer to devotional labor, showing up night after night for years to perform careful, exacting, frequently tedious work, because the cumulative weight of thousands of correctly completed small tasks was precisely what made the larger achievement possible. There is no dramatic single moment in most of their individual nights. There is only the steady accumulation of care applied consistently across an enormous stretch of time. It is worth remembering this when picturing the scale of what they collectively accomplished. Breaking the Enigma cipher was not a single dramatic breakthrough achieved by a lone genius in a moment of inspiration. However satisfying that version of the story might be for a film, it was the product of thousands of ordinary nights, performed by thousands of ordinary women, each one doing her small, careful piece of an enormous collective puzzle, night after night, for years, without ever necessarily seeing how her individual contribution fit into the larger whole. The same is true at Oak Ridge, where the enrichment of enough uranium for a single weapon required not a single dramatic experiment but months of continuous, carefully monitored operation across more than 1,000 separate Calotron units, each one requiring its own dedicated operator, watching, adjusting, recording, hour after hour, night after night, in a rhythm that would have seemed from the outside almost hypnotically dull. And yet that dullness, sustained with genuine discipline across an enormous scale, was precisely what allowed an achievement of this magnitude to occur at all. There is something worth carrying into your own rest tonight, in this particular observation. Enormous things are very often built not from single dramatic moments, but from an accumulation of ordinary, careful, unglamorous hours, performed faithfully by people who may never fully see the shape of what they are building. The women of these three institutions understood this instinctively, perhaps because they had no other choice, working as they did without ever being given the full picture of what their labor amounted to. They simply did the next careful thing, and then the next, and then the next, night after night, until the war ended and the shape of what they had built finally became clear all at once in headlines and history books that mostly forgot to mention their names. Among the fragments that have survived from this era, tucked into archives and family collections and the occasional published memoir, are pieces of correspondence that never quite managed to say what their writers most wanted to say. Letters drafted and redrafted, sentences begun and crossed out, women trying again and again to find some way of describing their lives that would not violate the promise they had made. Consider the particular difficulty of writing home from inside this kind of silence. A young woman wants quite naturally to reassure her parents that she is safe, that her work is meaningful, that the separation is worth what it is costing everyone involved. And yet nearly every specific detail that might actually accomplish that reassurance is precisely the kind of detail she has been forbidden to share. What remains, after all the forbidden specifics have been stripped away, is a strange, hollowed-out kind of letter, full of weather reports and questions about home and small, safe pleasantries, circling endlessly around an absence that both writer and reader can sense, but neither can name directly. Some women developed over time an entire private vocabulary for managing this gap, a set of phrases vague enough to satisfy the censors and the secrecy oath alike, while still carrying some small trace of genuine feeling through to the people who loved them. Work is going well. I'm learning a great deal. I cannot say more than that, but please know that I am proud of what I am doing here. These sentences appear in slightly varied forms across dozens of surviving letters from this era, a kind of shared code among women who could not describe their actual code breaking, developed independently across an ocean, by women who never met each other and never compared notes, and yet arrived at strikingly similar solutions to the exact same problem. Parents, for their part, learn to read between these careful lines, sensing the shape of something significant even without access to the specifics. Several surviving family letters show mothers responding with a kind of deliberate, gentle restraint, acknowledging their daughters' vague reassurances without pressing for the details they must have wanted, understanding, in whatever way felt sufficient, that the war had placed their daughters somewhere that could not be described, doing something that could not be named, and that respecting that boundary was itself a form of support their daughters badly needed. Not every family managed this gracefully. Some parents pressed repeatedly for details their daughters could not provide, interpreting the vagueness as evasion, or worse, as evidence of some kind of trouble their daughter was too ashamed to admit to. This particular strain, the friction between a young woman's genuine desire for her family's understanding and the legal and moral obligation that prevented her from providing it, shows up again and again in the private accounts that have survived, a quiet, ongoing source of tension that ran alongside the more obvious pressures of wartime separation and constant, exhausting shift work. What survives of this correspondence today reads, in retrospect, like a kind of parallel text, an entire layer of unspoken meaning running just beneath the careful, censored surface of ordinary wartime letters. A modern reader, equipped with the historical context these women's own families lacked, can often sense exactly what is being carefully avoided in a given sentence, exactly which vague phrase is standing in for an experience its writer desperately wanted to describe more fully. It is, in its own quiet way, a form of intimacy these letters were never quite able to achieve at the time. An understanding that has only become possible decades later, once the secrecy that shaped every sentence finally lifted enough to let the fuller context emerge. There is one more thread worth pulling gently at before we let this story settle into its final rest, and it concerns not what these women lost through their secrecy, which tonight's story has already spent considerable time examining, but what, in a more complicated and perhaps unexpected way, they gained. To be trusted deeply and completely with information that could alter the course of a war is itself a strange and heavy kind of honor, even when that honor arrives wrapped in obligations that will cost you dearly for years afterward. Many of the women who lived through this experience in their later interviews and memoirs describe a genuine, lasting pride that exists alongside and does not cancel out everything the secrecy took from them. They were, in a way, few of their peers back home ever were, given proof, early and decisively, that they were capable of enormous things, that their minds and their discipline and their careful attention mattered to outcomes far larger than themselves. This matters particularly when you consider the broader context these women were living within. This was an era that told women, consistently and from every direction, that their proper place was small, domestic, secondary to the more serious business conducted by men. And then, suddenly, in the middle of a global emergency, an entire generation of these same women found themselves handed responsibilities of genuine historical consequence, trusted with secrets that could reshape the outcome of the largest war in human history, asked to perform work that demanded real intellectual rigor and real discipline under real pressure. For many of them, that experience, however briefly it lasted, however completely the post-war world tried to walk it back afterward, left a permanent mark on how they understood their own capabilities. Anne Cara Christie's long subsequent career in American intelligence did not happen by accident. It happened because her wartime experience had shown her, decisively, exactly what she was capable of, and she refused to simply set that knowledge aside once the war ended, even as the world around her tried to usher her back toward more conventional post-war expectations for a woman of her generation. Even for the women whose post-war lives returned entirely to more traditional patterns, marriage, family, quiet domestic routines, the knowledge of what they had once done during the war did not simply disappear, even if they never spoke of it aloud. It remained quietly, as part of how they understood themselves, a private confirmation of their own competence and worth that no post-war social pressure could fully erase, even when it could successfully prevent that confirmation from ever being spoken aloud to the people closest to them. There is something worth carrying forward from this, something that complicates the straightforward narrative of loss that has run through much of tonight's story. These women were denied recognition. They were denied career advancement. They were, in many cases, denied even the basic intimacy of being fully known by their own families. And yet, underneath all of that genuine, real loss, something else persisted as well. The simple, private, unshakable knowledge of what they had actually done, carried quietly for the rest of their lives, whether or not anyone else ever learned to see it. Perhaps that is the closest thing to justice this particular story can offer decades after the fact. Not a full correction of everything these women were denied, because that correction at this point is simply no longer fully possible for most of them. But an acknowledgement, however late, however incomplete, that what they carried inside themselves all those years, that quiet, private confirmation of their own capability, was entirely, thoroughly earned, whether or not the wider world ever thought to say so at the time. Before we let this story rest entirely, it is worth gathering the scale of it once more, slowly, the way you might turn over a handful of small stones before setting them back down. Nearly 7,000 women at Bletchley Park, more than 3/4 of its entire wartime workforce, walking that blackout path night after night for years. Nearly 10,000 women at Oak Ridge, watching dials on machines they were never permitted to understand, refining, without knowing it, the fuel for a weapon that would end a war. Roughly 7,000 women at Arlington Hall, breaking codes that shaped the outcome of battles fought thousands of miles from the converted classrooms where they worked. Add to that the women of the Special Operations Executive, the Wrens serving at Commonwealth intelligence stations, the pilots of the Women Air Force Service pilots, and the number climbs well past 25,000, likely closer to 30,000, women who spent some meaningful portion of the war's middle years living inside a silence they had agreed to before they understood its full cost. 30,000 women, give or take, each one carrying her own specific version of the same essential arrangement, trusted with something consequential, sworn to protect it completely, and largely uncredited for what that trust actually produced. It is a number too large to hold in the mind as individual faces, individual stories, individual signatures on individual government forms. And yet each one of those 30,000 women was, in fact, an individual person, with her own particular reasons for signing that form, her own particular family waiting at home, her own particular way of carrying the weight of what she could not say. Somewhere among those 30,000 were women who went on to live long, quiet, entirely ordinary post-war lives, raising families, working modest jobs, never once hinting to anyone around them at the scale of what they had once been trusted with. Somewhere among them were women who carried real regret about the silence, wishing in their final years that they had found some way to tell the people they loved before it was too late. Somewhere among them were women who felt instead a quiet and genuine pride in having kept a promise that mattered, understanding their own silence as a final private act of service, continuing long after the war itself had ended. There is no single correct emotional response to a story of this scale, and tonight's telling has tried deliberately not to press toward one. What seems most honest, sitting with the full shape of it now, is simply this. These were remarkable women, doing remarkable work, under circumstances that asked an enormous amount of them, both during the war and for decades afterward, and the least that can be offered now, this many years later, is the patient effort of actually remembering them, as fully and as accurately as the surviving fragments allow. If you have made it this far into the night, drifting perhaps somewhere between waking and sleep, let this final image settle gently before the story closes entirely. Picture a long line of women stretching back across 80 years, walking home together in the pale light just before dawn, each one carrying the same particular kind of tiredness that comes from a night spent doing something that mattered. Something she could not fully explain, something that history very nearly failed to remember at all. Let them walk on now, into whatever rest they have finally earned. Let the fences fall quiet behind them. Let the whole long night at last be over. There is a particular sound that belonged to the exact moment one shift ended and another began, and it is worth spending a little more time inside it because it is one of the few genuinely universal experiences shared by every woman across every one of these three institutions, regardless of the very different work each of them performed. At Bletchley, the change happened with a quiet shuffle of coats and scarves being gathered, a murmured handover between the woman leaving her post and the one arriving to take it, a brief, practical exchange of information about where things stood, which settings had been tried, which machines seemed to be running a little rough tonight. There was rarely time for anything more elaborate than that. The work did not pause to accommodate a proper goodbye. It simply continued seamlessly from one set of hands to the next, the way a relay race passes its baton without either runner ever quite stopping. At Oak Ridge, the sound carried a different quality entirely, the low electrical hum of the calotrons continuing uninterrupted beneath the human activity happening around them as one young woman climbed down from her stool and another climbed up to take her place, exchanging perhaps only a few words about how the shift had gone, whether the readings had been steady, whether anything unusual had happened worth passing along. The machines themselves never stopped. could not afford to stop, so the human rhythm of the operation had to bend itself entirely around their constant, unbroken hum. At Arlington Hall, the handover carried its own particular texture. Stacks of intercepted messages passed from one desk to the next, a brief note about where the previous shift's analysis had left off, which patterns seemed promising and which had turned out to be dead ends. The work here had a slightly different rhythm than the more mechanical operations at Bletchley or Oak Ridge, more clearly intellectual, more visibly dependent on the specific insight of the individual analyst, and yet the underlying structure of the handover, one tired mind passing its work carefully to a fresher one, felt strikingly similar across all three places. What strikes anyone considering these three handovers together is how much unspoken trust each one required. A woman leaving her shift had to trust that the colleague replacing her would continue the work with the same care and precision she herself had brought to it. A woman arriving for her shift had to trust that whatever she had been told about the state of things was accurate, that nothing important had been left out or misremembered in the fog of an exhausting overnight shift. This trust extended silently, shift after shift, night after night for years, formed one of the quieter but more essential threads holding these entire operations together. It is worth imagining for a moment the particular kind of camaraderie that must have grown out of these repeated small handovers. The accumulated familiarity between two women who worked opposite shifts on the same machine or the same desk, who might barely know each other outside the context of this brief nightly exchange, and yet who came, over months and years, to depend on each other completely in a way neither of them could ever fully explain to anyone outside the small, secretive world they shared. Some of these working relationships outlasted the war itself, evolving into lifelong friendships between women who had met only in the brief overlap of a shift change, bonded by an experience so specific and so impossible to share with anyone else that only each other could ever fully understand it. Several of the oral histories collected in recent decades describe exactly this kind of enduring friendship. Two elderly women, reunited decades later, still able to finish each other's sentences about a wartime experience neither of them had ever been able to properly describe to their own husbands or children. There is something particular about night work itself, something that exists almost independently of what the work happens to be, and it is worth dwelling on before this story finally lets you rest, because it may be part of why this particular history sits so naturally alongside the kind of listening you are doing right now. Night work asks something different of a person than daytime work does. It asks you to hold your focus steady while your body quietly and insistently argues for sleep. It asks you to find a rhythm that runs against every instinct built into you by daylight and habit. Anyone who has worked through even a single overnight shift in any profession, in any era, understands the particular, hollowed-out quality that settles in somewhere around 3 a.m, the sense that the ordinary rules of time have loosened slightly, that the room you are sitting in has become, temporarily, a small island separated from the rest of the sleeping world. The women of Bletchley Park, Oak Ridge, and Arlington Hall lived inside that hollowed-out quality for years, not occasionally, not as an unusual exception to an otherwise normal schedule, but as the defining rhythm of their entire wartime experience. They learned, out of sheer necessity, how to find a kind of steadiness inside those strange, disorienting hours, how to keep careful attention alive even when every instinct in their bodies argued for rest. That skill, hard-won and rarely acknowledged, deserves its own quiet recognition alongside everything else these women accomplished. There is a particular intimacy that grows among people who share this kind of schedule. An intimacy separate from and different than the ordinary friendships built during daylight hours. The world sleeps around you, and you and your companions are, in a sense, the only people awake in it, tending to something the sleeping world does not know is happening at all. This creates a peculiar private closeness, a sense of shared secret purpose that exists whether or not the work itself happens to be classified. For these women, working genuinely classified material during these same disorienting hours, that ordinary night shift intimacy layered on top of an even deeper, more consequential secrecy, producing a closeness that few working relationships before or since have quite matched. Perhaps this is part of why their story settles so naturally into the kind of listening you might be doing right now, drifting somewhere between waking and sleep yourself. There is a strange, quiet sympathy between the disorienting hours these women once worked through and the disorienting hours many of us now spend awake, restless, waiting for sleep to finally arrive. Their nights and your nights are not the same, of course. The stakes could not be more different. But the particular texture of being awake when the rest of the world is not, of holding steady attention against a body that wants only to rest, connects across the decades in a way that feels, if you sit with it gently enough, oddly companionable. Consider, as you drift, that somewhere in the history of every long night like the ones these women worked, there eventually comes a morning, the shift ends, the dawn arrives, the exhausted worker finally walks home and finally rests, and the world, however briefly unaware of what just happened in the dark, keeps turning steadily toward whatever comes next. Your own night tonight will end the same way, quietly, gently, whether or not you notice the exact moment it happens. Let that thought carry you the rest of the way towards sleep, the way it once carried thousands of tired, careful, remarkable women toward their own well-earned rest, morning after morning, for years that mattered far more than most of the world ever knew. There is one more group worth naming before the story finally rests, a group that sits at the very edge of even this expanded telling. The women whose work supported all of this classified labor without ever touching the secrets directly, the cooks who fed the codebreakers, the drivers who carried them between stations in the dark, the cleaners who kept the huts and dormitories livable through years of round-the-clock occupation. At Bletchley Park, these support roles were staffed almost entirely by women as well, folded into that same three-quarters majority that made up the estate's total wartime population. A driver ferrying an exhausted codebreaker back to her dormitory at 4 a.m. was not, technically, privy to the classified content of the work happening inside the huts, and yet she lived inside the same fence, under the same restrictions, carrying her own version of the same silence, unable to explain to her own family why she spent her nights driving unmarked cars between buildings she was not permitted to describe. The cooks who staffed the canteens at all three institutions performed a kind of invisible labor within an already largely invisible story, feeding thousands of exhausted night workers at hours that matched no ordinary mealtime, keeping the whole operation fed and functioning without ever appearing in any account of what these institutions actually accomplished. Their names survive, if they survive at all, even more rarely than the names of the codebreakers and Calutron operators themselves, tucked away in payroll records that few researchers have ever thought to examine closely. It is worth resisting the temptation to rank these different forms of contribution against each other, to treat the codebreakers' work as inherently more significant than the drivers, or the Calutron operators as more consequential than the cooks. None of these institutions could have functioned without every layer of labor working in careful coordination, night after night, for years. The woman who kept the canteen running smoothly through a 4 a.m. shift change was, in her own essential way, just as necessary to the war effort's success as the woman decoding the messages down the hall, even though history has been, if anything, even less inclined to remember her name at all. This wider circle of forgotten contribution deserves at least this brief acknowledgement before the story closes, a reminder that the pattern of anonymous, essential, undervalued labor extended even beyond the specific, dramatic secrets at the center of tonight's telling, into every corner of the vast, quiet machinery that kept these wartime institutions running through years of unbroken, demanding operation. There is one last small thing worth noticing, tucked into the corners of the record that survives. Almost none of these women in the surviving accounts ever describe being asked at the time whether they wanted the recognition they were being denied. Nobody sat a 19-year-old codebreaker down in 1943 and asked her whether she thought her contribution deserved a headline someday. Nobody asked a Calutron girl whether she felt it was fair that her name might never appear in any account of the machine she spent 2 years faithfully operating. The question simply never came up because the entire arrangement had been built from the very beginning around the assumption that it would not need to. This matters because it means the recognition many of these women eventually did receive decades later in the form of a museum exhibit or an oral history project or a book that finally used their real names was never something they had spent their lives waiting for or expecting. It arrived, for most of them, as something closer to a surprise, a strange and moving late-life discovery that the silence they had carried so faithfully for so long was at last being allowed to lift, at least partially. At least for whichever fragments of their story had managed to survive intact. Several of the women interviewed in their final years described this experience with a particular kind of quiet astonishment, an emotion that does not map cleanly onto simple gratitude or simple relief. They describe something more like disbelief, a difficulty fully accepting that the thing they had spent an entire lifetime keeping carefully hidden was now suddenly being written about in books, discussed in museum galleries, asked about by researchers who seemed to already know more about their own wartime service than they themselves had ever been permitted to say out loud to another living soul. It is worth letting that particular strangeness settle here, near the very end of tonight's telling. These women did not do this work for the recognition that eventually, partially, imperfectly arrived. They did it because it needed doing, and because they had agreed to do it, and because, in the middle of an enormous global catastrophe, disciplined, careful, anonymous labor felt like the only honest response available to them. The recognition that has slowly followed in the decades since is not the reason their story matters. It is simply, gently, evidence that the world has finally begun asking the right questions, however many decades too late those questions arrived. So here, gathered together one last time before sleep finally takes over, is what tonight's story has tried to hold gently in its hands. Women recruited through crossword puzzles and half-remembered school German, and a simple willingness to leave home for work they could not yet understand. Women who signed their names to a promise before they knew what that promise would actually cost them. Women who spent years of their young lives working through the coldest, quietest hours of the night, tending machines and codes and secrets that would help determine the outcome of the largest war in human history. Women who came home on leave and told their own mothers, gently and untruthfully, that they simply did secretarial work. Women who kept that same untruth alive for 30, 40, even 70 years, carrying it all the way into old age, sometimes all the way to their own deathbeds, without ever finding a moment that felt safe enough, or perhaps simply necessary enough, to finally set it down. Women whose competence, demonstrated repeatedly and decisively under enormous wartime pressure, evaporated from the historical record almost the instant the war that required it came to an end. And women too, who are only now, slowly and imperfectly, being given back their names through the patient work of historians and researchers and family members, finally piecing together fragments that had sat quietly in drawers and archives for the better part of a century. Women like Eleanor Ireland and Gladys Owens and Margaret Rock and Genevieve Grotjan and Cathy Strickland and Anne Cara Christie and thousands upon thousands of others whose names simply did not survive clearly enough to be spoken here tonight, though their nights mattered every bit as much as the ones we could name. This is, in the end, a story about a very particular kind of quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of a settled evening, the kind you might be sinking into right now, but a harder, more deliberate quiet, one imposed by necessity and maintained by promise, carried for decades by women who rarely complained about the weight of it, even when that weight was, by any honest measure, considerably more than should ever have been asked of them. Tonight, in the gentlest way this kind of story allows, we have tried to set a small part of that weight down, if only for the length of one long, quiet telling. Let their nights at last be finished. Let yours now begin to close as well. There is something gently reassuring in this detail, tucked into an otherwise heavy story. However isolating the secrecy surrounding this work may have been in relation to the wider world, it did not isolate these women entirely from each other. Inside the fence, inside the hut, inside the control room, they had each other, night after night, shift after shift, carrying the same impossible secret together, even when they could carry it with no one else at all. As tonight's story draws toward its final rest, it is worth asking, gently, what a listener today is meant to carry forward from all of this, beyond simple historical curiosity about three unusual wartime institutions. Perhaps it is this, somewhere in your own family history, in the stories that were never quite fully told, in the relatives whose working lives remain vague and unexplained even now, there may be a version of this same pattern, quieter and smaller in scale, but built from the same essential material. A woman whose competence went unrecognized, whose contribution was folded silently into someone else's credit, whose full story was never considered important enough to carefully record. This does not require a wartime secret to happen. It happens in smaller ways, constantly, in ordinary families, in ordinary workplaces. Whenever someone's careful, essential labor is simply assumed rather than properly seen. Tonight's story asks nothing more complicated than this: that we notice, a little more carefully than we might otherwise, the quiet, essential work happening around us, performed by people whose names we might never think to ask for, whose contributions we might otherwise simply take for granted. It asks that we extend where we can the same patient curiosity to the people around us now that historians have only recently begun extending to the women of Bletchley Park, Oak Ridge, and Arlington Hall 8 decades after the fact. It is a small thing to ask in the grand scheme of what these women actually gave, but it is perhaps the most honest way of honoring them that remains genuinely available to us now, this far removed from the actual events, unable to give them back the recognition they were denied during their own lifetimes, but entirely capable of extending that same careful attention forward to the quiet, essential contributions still happening all around us, in rooms and roles we might otherwise never think to notice. It is late now, later than when we began, and the story has carried us through blackout paths and dormitory rooms, through control panels and coded messages, through decades of silence and the slow, patient work of finally breaking it. Let the details settle now. Let the huts fall dark. Let the dials, wherever they are, finally come to rest. Picture, one last time, that 18-year-old woman with her signature drying on a government form, stepping out into a night she cannot describe to anyone she loves. She does not know yet how long her silence will last. She does not know that her work will help end a war, or that her name might not survive clearly enough to be spoken aloud again for 70 years. She only knows that the night shift is starting, and that there is work to do, and that she has agreed, quietly, to disappear into it. Let her rest now, along with all the others who walked that same path beside her, in huts across an English estate, in control rooms carved into Tennessee hills, in a converted school in Virginia where etiquette lessons once gave way to some of the most consequential intelligence work of the century. Let their names, the ones we have, settle gently into memory. Margaret Rock, Joan Clark, Eleanor Ireland, Gladys Owens, Ruth Huddleston, Genevieve Grotchen, Anne Cara Christie, Catty Strickland, and all the others, the vast, quiet majority, whose names the record never kept, but whose hours, whose nights, whose careful, patient attention mattered just as much. And if you find yourself drifting before this story is quite finished, remember that it will be waiting for you tomorrow, along with the rest of our library, as an audiobook on Spotify, the link tucked into the description whenever you need it. The war is over now, in this story, and the lights are going out across 3 continents, one by one, the way they always did at the end of a long shift. Somewhere, a woman is walking home through a countryside just beginning to lighten with dawn. Somewhere, a needle finally sits still. Somewhere, a promise, kept for decades, is finally allowed to rest alongside the woman who kept it. Close your eyes now. Let the huts go quiet. Let the dials go dark. Let the whole long night finally and gently come to an end. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. If any of these places have a piece of your own family's history tucked inside them, a grandmother who never explained her wartime job, a great aunt who simply said she did secretarial work, tell us about her in the comments. We would love to help keep her story from disappearing too.